Hello class. This is going to be a lecture on the presidency for the Intro to American Government class, and it's the next to last lecture. We're going to do this lecture on the presidency. Then next week, at the beginning of the week, we're going to do a lecture on Congress, and then the week after that, we will put your final exam on with your time that you're taking it and all that kind of stuff. And that should be it for the rest of the semester. Again, I want to apologize for the fact that we've had to conduct our class this way for the second half of the semester, but obviously the coronavirus wanted to have its say. And I guess within that context, I did get some bad news. A good friend of mine, a former judge who had been retired in Mahoning County, died of the coronavirus last week. So this is real for me now, and it's really sad because we weren't able to attend the funeral or any of that kind of stuff. So guys, be careful and stay well out there. Okay, so as I said, we're going to talk about the presidency today. And what we're going to do is, I've got this brief outline for you. We're going to give you an introduction to the powers of the president. I mean, what is it that the president can or can't do? The requirements to be president of the United States, the powers of the president more formally, and we break them down into three groups: these formal and or constitutional powers, implied powers that come somehow or derive somehow from formal powers, and what we're calling extra-legal powers, or some people refer to them as constitutional ambiguities. So powers that presidents have cited that no one is quite sure if the president really has them or not. So that's what we're going to talk about. And as I said, by way of introduction, we're going to talk about the powers of the president. What can the president do? What can't the president do? And we want to look at some recent examples of this. And presidential scholars, in talking about presidential power, has said the American presidency is potentially the most powerful officer in the entire world. But the question is, how important is the president? How much power does the president really have? What's the relationship between presidential power, congressional power, and judicial power? So I think the best way to approach this is kind of use some examples. So can a president of the United States unilaterally decide that they want to bomb another country? And when I say unilaterally, what I mean is they say, you know, I think, and we'll use an example here, we should bomb Iran because I don't like some of the things they're doing. I don't like how they've interfered with our naval exercises. I don't like how they've interfered with our activities in Iraq. And I'm going to just bomb them. So can the president do that? Unilaterally just say, I'm going to bomb people. And there's a big debate about this. And again, this is not just a hypothetical. This is something that happened very recently, in the sense of President Trump had ordered his military that if Iran were to retaliate for our assassination of their general, that we would immediately bomb them. And he talked about identifying 50 to 60 sites, some of which were not military, but rather cultural or religious, which is an interesting thing to do. So can the President of the United States, in this case President Trump, say that's what we're going to do and not consult with Congress? Can the President of the United States, after Congress has appropriated money for a project, unilaterally withhold it and say, no, I'm not going to spend it? And again, this is another example of something President Trump actually did do. President Trump withheld appropriations that had been made by the United States Congress to the Ukraine for the purchase of military weapons so they could defend themselves against a Russian invasion. And that, that was the whole controversy where Trump was telling his ambassadors, telling his representatives to Ukraine, look, tell the president of the Ukraine that they will get their funding if they do us a favor. This quid pro quo, which his representative, his spokesperson said, get over it, yeah, we did it, no big deal. And then he denied it, having said that. And then the president went back and forth in terms of what he said or he didn't say. But can the president just unilaterally withhold funds that have been appropriated? Can the president, during a criminal investigation by the United States Congress, direct members of his administration not to testify? So again, this is a real example. Trump told members of his administration that they were not going to be allowed to testify in front of the United States Congress, which had subpoenaed them. So he said his Secretary of State couldn't testify, his Secretary of Defense couldn't testify, his White House legal counsel couldn't testify, his press secretary couldn't testify, and his chief of staff could not testify. Is he allowed to do that? And it was a criminal investigation of wrongdoing in his administration. And then when these people didn't testify, and Congress said we need these people to get the evidence and provide the evidence, and the White House wouldn't provide the evidence requested either, documents and phone calls. The president later said, see, there was no evidence against me. Of course there was no evidence against him. He didn't allow it to come forward. Can the president, after a U.S. naval investigation of members of their special forces, which led to a conviction of a member of the special forces for shooting an innocent woman and also taking pictures with dead corpses, decide he's going to pardon that person and ask them to be reinstated to the SEALs against the recommendation of the commanding officers and the military tribunal which heard this case? Another question. Can the President of the United States, in this case again, President Trump has done this, as he did with the U.S. Navy, after someone is criminally convicted for not testifying against the President of the United States, and then they're sentenced to jail, pardon them? I mean, think about the ramifications. If someone is doing a criminal investigation, find someone guilty of something, the president can then just unilaterally pardon them, then it seems to me you can commit criminal actions with impunity if you know you're going to be pardoned anyway. So these are some of the kinds of questions that we have to deal with and try to resolve. And many of these kinds of issues, like the subpoena power, for example, are before the courts right now. Courts of appeals trying to decide this. Courts of appeals trying to decide whether or not the President of the United States should have to have his tax returns made public or not. Especially, again, when his returns are subject to a criminal investigation. Whether or not members of administration can ignore subpoenas by citing executive privilege. So we have to understand, what are the powers of the president? And how do we define them? Well, the first thing we want to look at before we talk about these powers even more explicitly are the requirements to be President of the United States. What are the requirements? And the formal requirements to be President of the United States are pretty simple. Article 2 of the United States Constitution tells us what the formal requirements are, and here's all they are. You must be a U.S.-born citizen. You have to be 35 years of age. And you have to live in the United States for a minimum of 14 years. So those are the formal requirements. Now, are there informal requirements? Well, most presidents have had significant public service. They've been governors, they've been senators. So if you look at the past presidents, President Obama was a senator from Illinois. President Bush was a governor from Texas. President Clinton was a governor from Arkansas. President Bush 1, the father, was a senator and a vice president, director of the CIA. President Reagan was governor of California. President Carter was governor of Georgia. And so forth and so on down the line. So for the most part, what we've seen is that for most candidates, in order to be seen as a viable presidential candidate, they have significant elected experience at the highest levels. Now, again, President Trump is an exception to that rule, for good or bad, depending upon how you look at it. And as a matter of fact, President Trump is the first president since 1956 who had no elected public service. Since 1956. It's over 60 years ago. This is the last time. So again, you don't have to have experience. It's not a formal requirement. Once you're elected to president, the question is, what's the term of office? And this has changed over time. In 1951, we passed the 22nd Amendment. And the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution limits the president to 2 terms. To 2 terms. So in other words, the president can serve at most 2 terms. And they are elected for a 4-year term, so they serve 4 years at a time. Now, there is an exception to this, and that's if the President of the United States is impeached. And obviously, when we talked about impeachment, we have impeachment and then removal. Those are 2 separate processes. So impeachment is the bringing of criminal charges against a president. And removal is then, after these charges are brought by the House, the Senate agreeing to remove the president for those high crimes or misdemeanors. So according to Article 1, Section 2 and 3 of our Constitution, Congress has the ability to remove the president from office for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And as we said, the House has to bring the charges and enumerate the charges, and then the Senate acts as a tribunal and decides whether or not to remove, and you need a 2/3 vote. Now what we've seen, these removal attempts tend to be very partisan. And there have been a number of attempts to impeach and remove presidents. So, for example, obviously we just had it again with President Trump. And prior to that, we had it with President Clinton, who was also impeached. Now, both Trump and Clinton were impeached, but they were not removed. And the votes in the Senate went along pretty much partisan lines. So, with President Trump, every Democrat voted to remove him, and only one Republican, and that was the Republican from Utah, and that was Mitt Romney. And ever since Mitt Romney cast that vote to remove the president, he has no longer been invited to the White House for any formal ceremony. So, absent impeachment, a president can serve 2 4-year terms. As president, we said this could be a very powerful office, and the extent of the power is dependent upon how much authority a president wants to exercise. So some presidents want to exert a lot of authority, want to do everything, like President Trump, and other presidents are more reluctant to use presidential power, like President Eisenhower. So when we talk about presidential powers, we broke it down into 3 categories: formal, implied, and extra-legal. When we talk about the formal powers of the president, these are the powers that are derived directly from the United States Constitution. So they are considered the clearest powers and authorities of the president, over which there's usually very little debate. So what are these powers? Well, the Constitution gives the president the power of chief administrator. So according to Article 2, Section 1, the very first statement in Article 1 says, "The executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States, and he shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed." So what does that mean? Well, generally in the past, most presidents thought that meant that Congress passes the laws, and then the president is responsible for enacting them and doing what Congress wants those laws to do. Now, this president has interpreted that very differently. He said that how he interprets this article is that because he's the chief executive and he has to have laws faithfully executed, that means whatever he thinks the laws mean, not what Congress thinks. So the chief administrator clause can take on very formidable authority depending upon how you want to interpret that key clause. But no one disputes that it's a constitutional prerogative. What the dispute seems to be about now is exactly what does it mean? Another power of the president, constitutionally, is the President of the United States is Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Services, the Army, the Navy, the Marines of the United States, and of the militia of the several states. And this is according to Article 2, Section 2. And again, the question becomes, what does this really mean? So yes, the President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Services. How much authority does that give the President? Does it give the President the right to unilaterally bomb any country that he deems necessary and in our national interest to bomb? Now what we've seen is in response to the threats he made in regard to Iran, Congress passed a resolution again recently saying the president cannot unilaterally bomb other countries without their consent. Their argument being that sure, the president's commander-in-chief, but only Congress can declare war. That's a constitutional authority of the United States Congress. Only Congress has the right to declare war. So if presidents can bomb whatever they wanted, what would that power to declare war really mean? It would be made meaningless. So you see a dispute between the Trump administration and Congress over this, and in this case, even the Republican Senate seems to disagree with President Trump's interpretation. Other powers of the president, formal powers, constitutional powers. The Constitution gives the president very important powers over diplomacy. and some say because of these powers, in many ways, the president can be seen as the chief diplomat. And again, if you look at the Constitution in Article 2, Section 2, it says the president has the power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties. So this is where you can see where the president has entered into negotiations with China, with Mexico, renegotiating NAFTA, taking us out of a lot of the treaties with the environmental regulations and that type of thing, overturning what President Obama did in those areas. And he said, hey, I'm the one who can negotiate treaties. I don't like the current treaty, so that means I can also revoke them and renegotiate them. And there's been some dispute over that. And, in terms of these formal constitutional powers, this is probably the most contentious period I've ever seen between President and Congress and the judiciary since the Nixon administration in 1968. Other powers. Well, the president, again, according to the Constitution, has been provided some legislative powers. So Article 2, Section 3 of the Constitution says that the President of the United States can give a State of the Union address in which he outlines his legislative recommendations. He can recommend legislation. And then according to Article 1, Section 7, he can veto legislation that's passed by Congress. So if legislation is passed by the House, passed by the Senate, delivered to the White House, he can veto it. It's a presidential veto. And if he vetoes it, it can only be overridden by a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate. And that's really hard to get 2/3 of the House and the Senate to agree to anything. So this is a formidable legislative power of the president. And then lastly, and it's another source of contention right now, is according to Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, the president can grant pardons. And it says that the president has the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. Well, what does that mean? Well, the one question that President Trump asked the Justice Department was, if he was impeached, could he pardon himself? No other president ever really asked that question before. And the Justice Department said that they didn't think he could do that. So then the next question became, okay, so people who've been investigated in these hearings, can he pardon them? And the answer to that's kind of been mixed, with some people saying yes. So he has pardoned a number of people who have done things that have upset Congress and upset the courts. The sheriff in Arizona, who wouldn't listen to the court's decision on how he had to act in regard to immigration and withholding illegal aliens and how he had to do that. And therefore was sentenced to jail. And after he was sentenced to jail, President Bush pardoned him, calling him a hero. So those are these formal powers. So as you can see, clearly the president has formal powers. The only question in regard to these formal powers is to what extent can they be exercised? What exactly do they mean? Now, in addition to these formal powers, presidents have what we refer to as implied or inherent powers. What is an implied or an inherent power? Well, these are powers that the Constitution doesn't explicitly grant or mention, but has been logically inferred by presidents to exist as a result of their formal powers, that they're somehow essential to carrying out their formal powers. So they can logically be inferred from the Constitution or statutory delegations. And probably the most controversial power, implied power, that's being used right now is the idea of an executive order. An executive order. And let me define an executive order for you. An executive order is a presidential directive to an administrative agency to carry out a policy in a specific way consistent with what the president wants. And these presidential directives carry the force of law. They can create or modify laws and policies without the direct approval or consent of Congress. So as you can imagine, Congress does not like this, because they say, look, we're the lawmaking body, not the President of the United States. How can the President give legal directives that might contradict what we want? So again, they're formal directives of the President that govern executive branch operations. Now, this is not a new power. It is not a new implied or inherent power. Presidents have been using this power for a number of generations. And Congress seems to go back and forth based upon its partisanship in terms of whether or not they think executive orders is a good thing. So, for example, when President Obama was president, and the House and the Senate were both Republican, and he issued executive orders, they said that this was illegal, unconstitutional, and condemned Obama. Mitch McConnell condemned Obama for using these kinds of powers. But now, when President Trump's using them, the Democrats are condemning them, and the president's Republican Party is saying, yo, no, this is fine, you can do this. So they've changed their perspective. Well, how far can executive orders go? What kinds of things can they relate to? Generally, the legal approach to this has been that a president can only issue an executive order pursuant to their legitimate constitutional or legislative authority. So what does that mean? Well, just as an example, where administrations have gone back and forth, again, Obama had one perspective and Trump overturned it when he came office. The whole idea of who can serve in the military. Who can serve in the military? So President Obama had issued an executive order saying that transgender troops can serve in the military. And they had. Many of whom were highly accomplished and won numerous awards for courage and valor. When President Obama did this, he did it with an executive order because Congress would not pass legislation saying that transgender troops are allowed to serve. So why could Obama do this? Obama said, I'm doing it according to my statutory and constitutional authority. Constitutionally, I am the commander-in-chief, which means I am the head of the military. Therefore, according to my constitutional powers, I can say who can serve and who can't. And by the way, if they don't like that argument, legislatively, the United States Congress passed the Selective Service Act. And the Selective Service Act established the Selective Service Commission, which determines who can serve and who can't serve. And by the way, who's the head of the Selective Service Commission by definition? The President of the United States. So if they do not pass a law saying that these people can't serve, I can also say they can serve according to statutory delegation. Now, as soon as President Trump was elected, he used those same exact arguments to then withdraw the right of transgender troops to serve. So he issued an executive order revoking the executive order of President Obama. So that's how it works. Now again, that doesn't mean a president can issue an executive order for anything they want. They cannot go against the specific language of a statute unless they're doing it pursuant to some constitutional power. So they can't say, tomorrow we are going to eliminate the Environmental Protection Agency. Can't do that. That was passed by Congress, and there's no authority of the president just to eliminate it unilaterally. Now, can he change the standards that they may use to determine what's pollution, what's air pollution, what's water pollution? Absolutely. As head of the EPA, and he's done this in regard to asbestos, he's done this in regard to coal mining, he's done this in regard to numerous carcinogens, which are cancer-causing agents. Okay, so that's what we mean by an executive order, and that's an inherent power. Now the last category of authority are these what we're referring to as extra-legal powers, or some refer to them as the constitutional ambiguities. So when addressing extra-legal powers of the president, what I want to clarify and emphasize is that what we're referring to here are powers that presidents have asserted and claim that they possess that are not explicitly, or even in some cases implicitly suggested anywhere in the United States Constitution. However, these ambiguities have not stopped President, especially our current one, from utilizing these powers to greatly expand their authority versus Congress and the role of the President to dictate our